them job skills, to help end systemic barriers to integration, to help them find jobs, and to end discrimination, he would have done a great service to Canada. But what was the multiculturalism branch, the multiculturalism minister, and multiculturalism dollars? It was dollars to get votes. It was songfests, dance festivals, carnivals, and parties, not nation building. Now, people say Pierre Trudeau was a great friend to the immigrants of this nation. Ask new Canadians what they think about Pierre Trudeau. Oh, he was great. He brought thousands of new Canadians to Canada. That's a myth. The reality is, under Trudeau, immigration levels in Canada were cut by 2/3. 2/3 under Pierre Trudeau. It went in a steep decline from 1974 onwards. Now, you may agree or disagree with the policy, but the view of his government was that immigration was not a source of building the economy, and he didn't want immigrants to take jobs that were currently held by Canadians. So what did he do? He said, we won't use immigration as an economic tool. We'll curry favor with the immigrant communities by allowing them to sponsor family members, brothers, sisters, parents, grandparents. And that's what endeared him to many immigrant communities, because he was allowing their family members to come over, where for the previous 30 years, immigration had been, send us your skilled workers, the people who want to help build the nation. It was back in the 1960s, the fact that within a very short period of time, immigrants coming to Canada were earning more than average Canadian, people who had been here for many, many years were earning. They were working very hard. But Trudeau changed that dynamic completely. Now Trudeau, let's go with a couple more myths. He was the champion of individual rights, and the War Measures Act was not his idea. The reality was, rather than responding to a request from the provincial government of Quebec and the municipal government of Montreal, that the War Measures Act was Pierre Trudeau's idea. And it was drafted, written, prepared by his principal secretary, Marc Lalonde. The War Measures Act, in its design, in its implementation, was not designed to thwart terrorism or to capture the terrorists. In Pierre Trudeau's mind, it was a political tool. He wanted to shape Quebec out of what he described its society as a disordered state. Now, changing cultural, societal values is not something that you bring in the army for, or you suspend civil rights, civil liberties, throw 500 people in jail without charge, without bail, or to invade 10,000 homes without a warrant. And we're not talking about high-level terrorists here. Take the case of Nick Oppenheimer, who was a municipal councillor, a bon vivant in Montreal, a great raconteur and storyteller, a provocateur, who would say some things about separatism. Not that he was a great separatist, of course, it was on the list. He would be arrested. But he had moved, and at his residence was a family, a Vietnamese family, new immigrants to Canada. But of course, they were in the right place at the wrong time, and were taken from their home, arrested, thrown into jail. And it was only a couple of days later that they found out where old Nick Oppenheimer lived and arrested him. But imagine if you'd been taken by the police from your home. The War Measures Act did nothing to help capture the terrorists. It did nothing to help return James Cross. It was, in fact, the day after the War Measures Act was declared that Pierre Laporte was murdered. And the War Measures Act did nothing to attach Quebecers to federalism or diminish the cause of separatism, quite the opposite. Let's talk about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Liberals say that Pierre Trudeau is the founder of rights for Canada. Without him, without the Charter, there would be no rights in Canada. This was a great foundational document, which of course is nonsense. The right of individuals in Canada goes back to the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the Petition of Rights, even John Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights. What the Charter did fundamentally. It was a codification of rights. It was an Americanization of our Constitution. It was the transfer of a massive amount of power away from our elected officials, away from Parliament, and those who are accountable, into the hands of the judiciary. Now, you may think the judiciary is a better place to make these decisions than Parliament, but it was not the birth of rights for Canada. You may actually think that these rights should be in the hands of politicians. We can't say that Canada is any further advanced on rights with the Charter than Great Britain is, for example, today, without a Charter. You know, we're largely in the same boat, except for accountability. Judges here and parliamentarians in Great Britain. Let's remember, for all his love of liberty, individual freedom that he talks about, Pierre Trudeau restricted the ability of you to choose your health care. He restricted the ability of you to watch the television shows you want to watch, the radio shows you want to listen to, by telling you the amount of content, Canadian content that have to be. This was not an act of freedom. So let's give him some credit. At long last, our Constitution was brought home to Canada. It was the British North America Act. Our Constitution wasn't even a truly Canadian document. Pierre Trudeau brought this back to Canada. Sure, one day it was going to happen. It was going to happen when the time was right. But the reason the BNA Act was the BNA Act as it was, and was in the hands of Great Britain up until 1982, is that the federal and provincial governments could never agree on an amending formula. How do we change our Constitution once it's here? I mean, we knew up until then that it was up to the Brits, you know, to change our Constitution if they wanted. Of course, they never did, unless we asked them to. But the federal and provincial governments could not agree on either an amending formula or division of power between the federal and provincial governments. But whenever we wanted to make a constitutional change, whenever the federal and provincial governments agreed on a constitutional change, the British government was only too happy, almost as a point of ceremony, to amend the Constitution without a word being spoken. Having our Constitution in Great Britain was no more significant to Canada than it is today to require the Governor General to sign every bill that is passed by the House of Commons and the Senate of Canada. So the great repatriation of the Constitution was not really a big deal, certainly not when a recession was going on or when we had a separatist government in Quebec. It was not the appropriate time to pass the Constitution. So, but people say, well, Quebec, you know, may have separated. You know, Pierre Trudeau kept Quebec in Canada. Now, certainly, he helped to win the 1980 referendum in Quebec. But he did so by misleading the people of Quebec, by promising to them constitutional renewal, which he implied was consistent with their hopes and aspirations for protecting the French language. But then he implemented a constitution that their government opposed. Not only their government opposed, but every legislator in Quebec opposed. Bob Stanfield had it right when he said, no premium of Quebec within living memory would have agreed to the Constitution of 1982, federalist or separatist. In fact, the only reason Trudeau got his Constitution through and the other premiers went along with it is because they thought, well, with the separatists, we'll never get a deal. Well, why wouldn't they have waited for a federalist to make a deal with the Constitution? There remains a price to be paid for the Constitution Act of 1982. And we saw no better example than the 1995 Quebec referendum that almost went to defeat. The nation almost went down to defeat in that referendum. Pierre Trudeau made life very difficult for federalists in Quebec. Not better, more difficult. Those who are trying to win hearts and minds in Quebec and an attachment to Canada with his rigid, authoritarian, non-compromising view of Canada that was not consistent with the view of Quebec, he made it very difficult, which also led to the defeat of the Beach Lake Constitutional Court. I think there's no one who's more responsible for the defeat. Now, you may think it's a good thing. I happen not to. I think we would have had constitutional peace for quite some time. We wouldn't have had a 1995 referendum if Beach Lake had passed. But, you know, federalists in Quebec were going out on a limb for Beach Lake, and Pierre Trudeau certainly was decisive in his defeat. So would Quebec have separated without Pierre Trudeau? Where's the evidence of that? It was while Trudeau was in power that the PQs came to power. And the closest we came to losing Quebec from Canada was after Beach Lake. Think of the BN Act as a prenuptial agreement for Canada. A prenuptial agreement. Everybody signed on. Quebec signed on, Ontario, Atlantic Canada. It's a prenuptial agreement. And we have an act. This is how we're going to be governed. This is how we're going to exist. And then one day, Pierre Trudeau comes in and abrogates unilaterally that prenuptial agreement and changes the basis of the sharing of power, intervenes into areas of provincial jurisdiction, socially, culturally, linguistically, because his view of Canada was a fully bilingual Canada, and that's what he wanted to implement. And he couldn't do that under the old Constitution. A Constitution is meant to unify, not divide. What Pierre Trudeau did with his Constitution, well, I'll use his words to describe his conduct. He called it a putsch, a knockout punch to the provinces. He called it a decisive blow. He called it a coup de force. Now that might be something you might hear a communist dictator or guerrilla or Fidel Castro say, but it's not how you build a nation. Lester Pearson would never, over the objections of the government of Quebec, have patriated the Constitution. Lester Pearson wouldn't have done it. MacDonald certainly wouldn't have done it. Laurier wouldn't have done it. It's a profoundly divisive act. Liberals love Pierre Trudeau. They still love him. You know, they elected his son as leader to build on his past glory. Now, it's a myth that Pierre Trudeau loved them back. Pierre Trudeau could not have cared less about the Liberal Party of Canada. He denigrated and insulted Liberal leaders before he became Prime Minister. He called Lester Pearson the dethroned Prince of Peace. He called all Liberal MPs donkeys, you know, who responded to the stable master. He insulted Liberals continuously. He was an active, fervent member, supporter of the NDP, which was the most socialist of parties. He switched from the NDP to the Liberals in 1965 because he said he didn't want to be a missionary all his life. He wanted to taste power. But once he left office, what did he do for the Liberal Party of Canada? No